Good morning. In religion, we always hear that we need to obey God. Does God want us to obey Him? Yes, of course. But I don't think God wants us to obey Him through the law. I really don't even think that God likes the law. And I think He's working towards something better. If we look in the book of Acts, we're kind of introduced to Saul of Tarsus, Paul, for the first time. And what I think is happening is a sort of transition coming from the disciples of Christ that walked with him and talked with him to the Apostle Paul, who was severed from those other apostles that walked with Jesus to start doing something different. I believe he had a different message. And it stems from God giving the law to expose man's righteousness. Yes, God gave the law to Moses, and he commanded the Israelites to follow that law. They failed miserably in that, but that was all part of the process and the demonstration. So God gave the law to expose man's unrighteousness, to expose how their righteousness falls short of the glory of God. However, the Jewish people of the day in the book of Acts and in Paul's time, they loved the law because of their righteousness. So the very reason God put forth the law was to show man that their righteousness was not good enough. But the Jews used the law to show how righteous they were. So they were doing the opposite of what God was trying to demonstrate by using the law. Paul had to connect the law to Christ and then transition his message to something better. So, yes, he did start with the law. He started talking about the circumcision gospel, and then he transitioned to something better, which is the uncircumcision, something that has nothing to do with law. If we look in Acts chapter 13, 38 through 39, it says, this is Paul speaking, "Let it then be known to you, men, brethren, that through this one is being announced to you the pardon of sins." See, with the law, the Israelites can only hope to be pardoned of their sin. They couldn't follow the law perfectly, and when they fell short, they needed to do sacrifices and things like that in order to get pardoned. So, Paul is talking about law here, but then he goes on to say in the second part of these verses, "And from all from which you could not be justified in the law of Moses." So he switches from being pardoned to justified here. So saying to these Jews that you cannot be justified through the law of Moses, you can only be pardoned. And now he says that you cannot be justified in the law of Moses. In this one, everyone who is believing is being justified. So if you're believing in Jesus Christ, you're being justified, and you're justified in a way that you cannot be justified through the law of Moses. You can only be pardoned through the law of Moses. So Paul is starting to make that switch here. In verses 46 to 47, he says, "Yet, since in fact you are thrusting it away and are judging yourselves not worthy of Ionian life, lo, we are turning to the nations." So the Jews overall rejected this message. They rejected the message of Christ fulfilling the law for them. So now the Apostle Paul, since the Jews rejected it, is now taking it to the nations. But as he continues to go to different places and give the message of Jesus Christ, who stands in his way all the time but the Jews? The Jewish people go wherever Paul goes, and they get people of the nations all stirred up to go against Paul. Gets everyone in a frenzy. They even, in the book of Acts, go to the government and say that Paul is starting an insurrection, just like they accuse Jesus of doing. He's starting insurrection. He's calling Jesus the king. And they're trying to get him in trouble that way because the Jews were jealous of what Paul was doing with the nations. The Jews were jealous of Jesus when he was walking the earth. They're jealous of Paul's message of Jesus um, after Jesus ascended into heaven. Paul really starts to break from the law in Acts chapter 17, looking at verses 23 through 26. 23 through 26, it says, I found a pedestal also, on which had been inscribed to an unknowable God, to whom then you are ignorantly devout. This one I am announcing to you. So here Paul is talking about the God that has appeared, the message that has appeared to him, the risen Jesus Christ and his message of God. Paul is now relating to the people. This is when he stood up in Athens, I believe, speaking to both the Jews and the Greeks. He says, the God who makes the world and all that is in it, he, the Lord, inherent of heaven and earth, is not dwelling in temples made by hands. Neither is he attended by human hands as if requiring anything, since he himself gives to all life, breath, and all. Further down, for in him we are living and moving and are. So Paul saying here is monumental. And this obviously gets the Jews jealous, but it's such a shift now from law. You could start seeing that in Acts chapter 17 here, because law means that God requires you to do something or follow whatever dictates he has given. But here Paul says God is not requiring anything. So there's no more law that God requires you to do. That's not the gist of his plan. And we can't give him anything that he hasn't given to us first, as if requiring anything, since he himself gives to all life, breath, and all. So God gives us everything. So if we're going to follow the law or do anything, it's all going to be based on God giving it to us first, and then we're just giving back to him what he has already given to us. We cannot produce anything on our own to impress God. God is God, and he gives us all. For in him we are living, we are moving, and are. He himself gives to all life and breath and all. That's everything. God is in complete control, and we can only give to him what he has given to us first. So he is not attended by human hands, and he's not in the temples. The Jews went to the temples. That's where God was. He was in the temple, and they did all these rituals because God was in the temple. Now Paul is doing away with that temple. He doesn't live in the temple is what he's saying. And that goes in the face of law, just as God not requiring anything goes in the face of law, because the law, the Jewish people required to do that for God. They boasted and they took pride in following that law. That was the source of their righteousness, of what they did for God. But now Paul is shattering that and saying that you can't do anything for God unless he gives it to you first. He doesn't require anything of you because he gives you life, breath, all. In him we live and move and breathe. So that's a big change coming forth here. And it's important to understand later in Acts chapter 26 that Paul is described as the worst of sinners, or the chief sinner. And he's going to be an example to how Jesus Christ is now going to operate with people. And being the chief sinner or the worst sinner, Paul was not a man that went out drinking or, having sex with prostitutes or stealing or abusing people. He wasn't doing that. That's not the sin that is being talked about here. But it still says that Paul is the chief of sinners, the worst sinner. So what sin was he guilty of? Well, Saul of Tarsus was a Pharisee. He tended to the coats of the men who stoned Stephen, a true believer of Jesus Christ. So Paul was a Pharisee. He followed the law. Paul exclaims that he did the best job of anyone in following the law. So why was he the chief sinner? Because he was following the law. That's what he was doing. That's what he was best at. He was the chief of following the law of the Pharisees. The law of the Pharisees killed Jesus Christ. If you look at Jesus, remember when he dealt with the adulterous woman, it was the law to put that woman to death, to stone her and the man she was having adultery with. That was the law. But Jesus bucked the law and said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." So everyone dropped their stones and went away because they're all guilty of sin. But constantly Jesus is going against law. How about all the times that he healed people on the Sabbath? That was against the law. And Paul is the chief of all sinners because he enforced the law. He went all around. He was going to Damascus to get Christians who were, or people who believed in Jesus Christ that were not following the law. So his sin was that he loved law. And that's why God calls him the chief of all sinners, because God is so against law. That's not in his heart. He had to reveal it to show us what it was, but now he's moving to something better. See, God gave law to compare man's righteousness with God. The law is God's standard, but man falls pitifully short of that standard. And if you look at Paul as we start to move through Romans here, in Romans 3:10 through 11, and actually in chapters 1 through 3, Paul is setting up the fact that, yeah, you need to follow the law completely and perfectly to be justified in God's sight, but nobody can do that. He says, no one's worthy, no, not one. No one is seeking God. So he puts us all in the same boat, that we can't achieve the law, and there's something else here. So he switches in Romans 3:20 and starts talking about that everyone is subject to the just verdict of God, because by works of law no flesh at all should be justified in his sight. So by doing the law, the very thing the Pharisees and the Jewish people took pride in, to following that law to be held in high esteem by God, Paul is saying no flesh at all can be justified in God's sight by following this law. For through law is the recognition of sin. And then Paul goes on in Romans 3:21, where he kind of clears his throat and says, yet now this is how you're going to get justified. In Romans 3:21, Paul says, yet now apart from law, so he's doing away with law completely now, a righteousness of God is being manifest, being attested by the law and the prophets, yet a righteousness of God through Jesus Christ's faith, for all and on all who are believing. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and wanting of the glory of God. So law is gone. It's now the faith of Jesus Christ and what he did, his death, entombment, and resurrection. That's what justifies you. And Jesus Christ gives to you his act, his faith, his death, his resurrection. And that's how you're justified, not by law. See, law is something that is done to force people to act a certain way. That's not God's heart. God's heart, and this is why Jesus Christ in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 23 to 28, gives up his reign. Jesus Christ gives up his reign because he so perfects people that you don't have to force people to do anything anymore. They don't have to follow law anymore, because it's in their spirit now to do the right things, because they want to do the right things. Law was done because you had to force people to follow rules in order to do the right thing. But in the future, and God's ultimate plan for Israel is to write his law on their hearts. So they follow the law not out of compulsion, but because that's what's in their heart and it's the natural thing to do. And when Jesus Christ is done perfecting his creation, that is exactly what we're going to be. We don't have to follow a law. We don't have to say, oh, gosh, I got to do this, I got to do that. We're just going to act naturally out of our perfected, loving selves. Because God fills us with all that he is. Because of the work of Jesus Christ, we are going to act the way that we should. We're going to act the way God wants us to, in joy and thanksgiving, because that's what's natural. The law is forcing you to do what's not natural for you. Once we're perfected, we're going to do exactly what God wants us to do, because that's what comes from our deepest desires. We're not there now, but we will when Jesus perfects us. Everyone will when Jesus gets done with us.